I've been lying in bed, wide awake, thinking, what's the simplest way to make a skirt? And not a circle skirt. I always hear people say, oh, just go make a simple circle skirt. Just cut 2 circles out of the fabric and put some elastic in the waistband and it'll fit you just right. But that's not always the case. The first circle skirt I ever made had an atrocious hem. And when I see pictures of beginners posting their easy circle skirts online, most of them have really bad hems as well. And that's because the hem itself is not a straight piece of fabric. It curves, and it curves along the bias and along the straight and cross grains of your fabric as well. That makes it a little bit more difficult to hem than other methods that are used, even ones where you piece a skirt together with separate pattern pieces. Another major problem I have with circle skirts is that I have a hard time being able to fit a full circle skirt out of 1 yard of fabric. I usually have to make a 2-piece circle skirt out of 3 to 4 yards of fabric to be able to make it long enough for me to cover my butt region, to be able to cover the whole butt. And I don't think using 3 to 4 yards of fabric and cutting 2 half circles out of your fabric to make a circle skirt is all that easy. I think there's a much simpler way to make a skirt, and I thought of it. So I'm going to show you too. So you want to start with a light to medium weight woven fabric. A woven fabric means that when you pull on it, it's not going to stretch. And a light to medium weight is going to have a lot of movement. It's going to be pretty soft and thin. And it'll also have a lot of drape to it. It'll be easy to fold and easy to wrap around itself. For the waistband, elastic that is woven as opposed to braided and about 3/4 of an inch thick is going to be the best elastic to use for this project, and that's the one I'm going to be using. And of course you'll need a tape measure, your scissors, a sewing machine, or hand sewing needle if you're going to sew by hand. My hips are the widest part of my body, so I'm going to measure around my hips. You want to take your tape measure all the way around the widest part of your butt and around the widest part of your hips. You don't want it to be too tight, but you do want it to be snug. So I'll be able to see that my hips are about 44 inches wide, so I want to make sure that my skirt is at least 44 inches wide. Now, if you're using a woven fabric, you always need to add ease into your garment so that when you're wearing it and you try to sit down, you can actually sit down and it won't keep you constricted. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 3 inches to that number you just took. That 3 inches will give you enough movement, and it will also give you a seam allowance. If you work with really big seam allowances, you might need to add a little bit extra to that number too. You're going to take that measurement starting from one end of your fabric to the other, and you're going to cut a line straight down the width of your fabric. I'm measuring 47 inches on my fabric, and you can mark it if you want, or you can just start cutting from there. We're just going to cut a straight line from the bottom to the top. There's also another little trick with a lot of woven fabrics. You can start with a little scissor snip and then rip the fabric apart. Sometimes it'll just come apart really easily like that for you. So the next thing you want to do is sew your first seam. So take your 2 ends of your fabric and fold them over each other. This would also be a good time to get some pins out if you plan on pinning your fabric. You might notice that you have a little bit of extra fabric hanging over one of the ends. That's okay, because we're going to cut that off after we sew our first seam. Always set your tensions and use a test strip of fabric before actually sewing. We're going to start at the top of our seam here and sew all the way down. I'm going to use a short stitch length on this fabric because it's pretty thin and it unravels pretty easily. Next, you'll want to finish your seam with a nice wide zigzag stitch. We're going to sew this zigzag right next to the seam you just sewed on the edge of your fabric. I ended up running 2 zigzag stitches side by side because I know this fabric will unravel really easily. The next thing we're going to do is cut along that edge next to your zigzag stitch. You're going to cut off all that excess fabric in the seam allowance. It's important not to actually cut your zigzag stitch when you're doing this step. If your fabric doesn't line up on that and you have one side that's longer, you can trim that off as well. You most likely will want to iron this seam flat. You don't have to. Some fabrics you don't really need to, but it will look nicer if you iron this flat before you move on to the next step. Now we're going to measure our elastic waistbands. I do recommend to stretch your elastic a little bit before you start sewing with it or measuring with it, because once you sew it into the garment, it will relax a little bit and lose some of its stretchiness. So I like this skirt to sit at a nice natural waistline. That's going to be the thinnest part of your waist. If your waist isn't very tapered or you're pretty straight all the way down, just measure it at where that bottom rib sits. If you have that body type I mentioned before, where your hips kind of taper or you have a lot of weight in your stomach, an empire waist will look a little bit nicer. That's this type of skirt that I have here, so measure it a little bit higher. When measuring an elastic waistband, you don't want it to be too tight and stretchy, but you also don't want to just wrap it around loosely and then let that go. I wrap it around snugly and make sure that's comfortable, that you can take a nice deep breath without it feeling too tight for you and squeezing. You want to make sure your elastic overlaps about 1 inch. And then mark with your thumb that spot you want to cut. And then just make a snip right there. And now you have the proper length elastic waistband. Next, we want to add that elastic waistband to our skirt. So the easiest way I think to do that is to make the casing first and fold down the waistband first, and then to add the elastic after. To do that, you want to make sure that when you fold it, you'll have enough room to insert that elastic into. If you sew it too tight, so if you sew it smaller than the elastic, it's not going to have enough room to go in there. And if you make it too big, that elastic's going to flop around in there. So I like to take the actual elastic itself and measure, just give it a little bit of extra room. It's a good idea to double check that you have your elastic folded evenly all the way around. When you hold it up, you don't want to see any big ridges or any obvious puckers in your fabric, and you don't want to have to be pulling it to get it to even out either. Most people fold the waistband to the inside when they make a waistband. You can fold your waistband to the outside, but especially when you have a fabric where it's really obvious what the inside or the outside of the fabric is, it's going to look a lot nicer if you fold your waistband towards the inside. So I'm going to use a straight stitch to sew my waistband in. When you sew an elastic waistband in, you have to leave a few inches so that you can slide your elastic in when you are done sewing. So I like to start I like to start pretty near where that back seam I made is, but I'm going to start a few inches in front and I'm going to finish a few inches before I get there so I have a little bit of room to feed my elastic through. Make sure that you sew very close to this edgy here. You want to have enough room to feed your elastic through. The inside should look like this, just a nice smooth hem. The outside should look very neat as well. You don't want to have a lot of ripples or waves on either side. Now we're going to insert the elastic into our waistband. Some people like to tie a safety pin around one end and then feed it through that way. It can make it a little bit easier. Your elastic shouldn't be too hard to feed through anyway, because like I said, we used the elastic as a guide to make sure the waistband was going to be wide enough for it. Also, be very careful not to twist your elastic. You can always pin your elastic in place to the edge of the waistband. When you get to the end, pull your elastic out a few inches and try to even out the ruffles a little bit throughout your skirt. We then want to attach just the two pieces of elastic together. You want to overlap them about the same as much as you had them overlapped on your body when you measured them. And you also want to make sure that they're not twisted in your waistband. If they're twisted now, they will forever be twisted. Some people like to use a straight stitch on elastic, some people like to use a zigzag. If I'm just attaching two pieces of elastic together like this, I'll use a straight stitch for that. Make sure when you put your elastic in your machine that you don't catch the edge of your fabric. If you have a machine with an attachable part here, you should unattach that. It might give you a little bit of extra room to work with. I like to sew two seams in my elastic. So I'll sew one along here to sew this elastic to the bottom. And I'll make one along here to sew the top elastic to this piece. That way when it stretches, it's not going to put as much tension on these edge pieces here, and they're going to be less likely to fall apart. Now we're ready to tuck this last bit of the waistband into the elastic. When you sew this last piece down, try to be careful that you don't sew into the elastic. It'll work better if you can just catch that very edge. You may need to stretch it a little bit, but I do try to make sure that the elastic has enough room to sit here so I don't have to stretch it too much. Now you can stretch your waistband evenly around the rest of your elastic. So now you should be able to see what that skirt looks like on you. If you need to adjust the fabric around the waistband or add a few darts to get the shape you want, you can do that as well. I like to hem up my skirts by trying them on and then just marking where I want to hem them up to. For this one, I'm pretty sure I want it to be about knee length, but just a little bit under the knee. So I'm going to take the hem of my skirt, I'm going to fold it up and then put a little pin in right underneath my knee. So that gives me an idea of how long I want my skirt to be. So now that you have a pin in your hem, you can cut the rest off and hem up your skirt. I like to give myself about an inch, inch and a half to finish my hems with. So I'm gonna take my tape measure. And measure from the edge of my skirt where I wanted it to sit to the end of my fabric that I want to cut off. I see there's about 7 inches there, a little more than 7. So I'm going to cut off 6 inches all the way around so that I have enough to make a hem. You also might want to make sure it's even all the way around. Now we're going to hem our skirt. You can either run a zigzag stitch around the outside and then fold it once, or you can fold it twice and then run either a straight or a zigzag stitch around, and that'll be a little bit more protective for your edge of your fabric. This is a little bit of a stronger way to finish your seams, so that's the one I'm going to go with. Now that you have your hem pinned, it's time to sew it down. I like to start in the back where that seam is. I'm going to run along the inside edge of that hem. Well, now you're basically done. I just recommend you go iron this hem flat before you wear it. So now you have a finished skirt. Like I said, this is the easiest way to make one. Your hem should look nice and even because we're not doing a circle skirt. We don't have to cut on the bias. We don't have to hem on the bias. And you're going to have a nice, smooth, straight hem. Your elastic waistband should be even all the way around, and it should be the length you want now that you've hemmed it. Let's try it on. Now, with this skirt, you might notice it's not terribly fitted up top, and if you're not really in shape, it might get a little lumpy. So styling is going to be the key to looking cute when you wear this skirt. I think it'll look much better with a flowy top and some heels. Now that is cute. Thank you for watching my video, everyone. If you want to make this skirt yourself, let me know how you did. If you have any other projects you want me to do, let me know and I might make them for you. Leave a like and subscribe as well if you want to see more of my content. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.